So, after six nominations and 50 years of composing some of the most iconic film scores in the history of the medium, he receives his first win today in the little sort of theater box towards the side of the theater where they had the Oscars, um, which to me looks like far and away the most fun and most interesting place to sit, along with some of those absolute legends of film composition. Having him do such a beautiful and touching thing to dedicate it firstly to the importance of storytelling, and secondly to his fellow composers, with a special honor to John Williams, um, who was also nominated with him that night, was such a absolutely delightful moment. Um, to win an Oscar after receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award, that's not very common. But I'm absolutely thrilled that it happened. Best original song. Um, I'm not alone in saying that I'm not super fond of Writings on the Wall by Sam Smith. I remember when the movie came out, there was quite a lot of talk about the fact that it was pretty lackluster, pretty phoned in Bond movie theme song. But having suffered through the other songs that were nominated for Best Original Song this year, I guess it was the best among some pretty bad options. It reminds me a bit of the current presidential race in that regard. Best Director, Alejandro G. I gotta make sure I say this right. Alejandro G. Inarritu. No. Inarritu. I'm so sorry, sir. Supreme Film Director. I should say your name right. Alejandro G. Inarritu. Gotcha. Um, I mean, not exactly a surprise there. Um, Again, to see for the second year in a row an absolute Mexican visionary uh, take the top award in one of the top categories is a true treat. Um, he's creating some of the most unusual, most experimental films that are being widely received by Hollywood. It's nice to see Hollywood respect that kind of filmmaking. And I think it certainly helps with the fact that we had, as everyone seems to point out, a rather whitewashed Oscar year to have the second year in a row. The Oscars recognize talent from a place that's not necessarily widely known for its film. Uh, Pretty much the only filmmakers from Mexico that are of any note in most Hollywood circles are actually good friends with this film director, which is Alfonso Cuarón and Guillermo del Toro. So that's nice. Brie Larson winning Best Actress. I don't have a really strong opinion about that. I didn't see The Room. I remember hearing a couple people talk about it actually like only about a month or two ago. I hadn't heard anything about it until then. Obviously, the big news that everyone will be talking about is the fact that Leo has finally won an Oscar. Um, he picked this role in The Revenant, I'm pretty sure, holding on to a chance that he's going to win an Oscar for the first time after six nominations. Probably a deserved win. Looks like there's some really great nominees on that list, but as excited as I would have been to see Michael Fassbender win for his absolutely stunning performance as Steve Jobs, it's probably fair to say that there's no one on that nomination list that deserved an Oscar quite as much as Leo. Probably this is the film that he's done where he deserved it most. The man's had an awful long time to think about what he would say in a speech if he ever won an Oscar. I think that showed up in the fact that he actually had one of the nicest, most well-prepared, most polished speeches of the night. It didn't wander, it wasn't desperate, and he didn't have that sort of fake, excited, nervous attitude. I rather liked the fact that he brought up climate change in his speech. as we do live in a strange world today where, in spite of all the evidence in front of us, in spite of the danger of ignoring it, we've allowed clear and present danger of corruption within industries and corruption within interest groups in our government to allow us to make the health of the environment and the well-being of our children, our children's children, to become an issue for political sort of gambling and political bartering. The existence of a pretty undeniable scientific fact to be questioned by major world leaders simply because it might not be a popular stance with some of their constituents. It's ridiculous. And the fact that we currently have a situation where all of the conservative frontrunners for the presidential race have apathetic at best stances on the subject of climate change is absolutely beyond belief. And while I don't necessarily always praise using the Oscars as a soapbox for big issues, this is one situation where, as he said, in order to film a movie set in the snow, they had to go, hundreds of miles further north just to find snow than the place that they were supposedly setting the movie in the dead of winter. So, good job, Leo. You got it now. Maybe you can have a little bit more fun in your movie choices and stop trying to desperately be super serious all the time just to prove the fact that you're an Oscar contender. So, Best Picture. I've learned everything I've ever heard about this movie tonight watching the Oscars. I hadn't heard of it at all. Mega ensemble cast film, bunch of big name actors playing a bunch of likable people, it seems. On the subject of sexual abuse scandals within the Catholic Church, it's very much an Oscar subject for nomination, the sort of thing that the Oscars like to nominate. I was a little bit surprised by the selection of that over some of the other options. But not overwhelmingly. It seems like in a year where the Oscars has gotten a lot of negative press for their ignoring of minorities, especially within their acting categories, this was a fairly political sort of Oscar year. In that they largely picked rather political films. They didn't pick abstract philosophical questions like The Room. They didn't pick sort of white people problems like Brooklyn. They didn't pick the sort of thing that I think the Oscars should pick more of, things like The Big Short, where they address sort of modern society. They didn't pick a return to form, Mad Max Fury Road. They didn't pick an artistic triumph like The Revenant. They didn't pick great films from aging film masters such as Bridge of Spies or The Martian. They picked a lesser-known film which didn't have as much flash, didn't win in the big categories. Those categories went to other films which took more artistic risk. They give it to a film which they, I guess, were hoping by giving it the Best Picture would raise the profile of the issue in question, which seems to be an Oscar move. One thing I was a little bummed about was to see a complete lack of awarding for The Martian. Ridley Scott's one of the absolute greatest filmmakers who's ever lived. And being at an octogenarian now, we only have a few more years seeing his output. And so to see some recognition of his work would have been absolutely delightful. Um, Great film, certainly something that deserved recognition. Um, in any case, uh, withstanding the blatant ignoring of sort of race questions in this year's Oscars, um, which was more than made up by a rather persistent and slightly bitter hosting from Chris Rock. It wasn't a terrible Oscar year. There have been worse. Some of the ones that I've made videos about for this channel have been worse. And I really quite liked the remembrance section where we talked about the people that died this last year, because we lost some real classics. In any case, I'm really tired. I'm going to go to sleep. I will do another one of these next year, so hopefully 2016 is a great film year. Bye.